Hello everyone. In this short video I'm going to be talking about variables and specifically how we use variables when coding in Python. So what are variables? A simple way to think about variables is to imagine them like a box or a container. I have several containers here. Let's think of them as variables. So at the moment our containers are empty. When it comes to coding, what can we put in our empty boxes or variables? So we use variables to store data. When we put something in an empty box, we call this assigning it a value. This is something you should remember, assigning a value. An empty box is like an empty variable. It's not really very useful. So when we create a variable in Python, we need to name it. I'm going to call this variable x. Let's see how we code this using Python. So we declare the variable x and we assign a value to it using the equals operator. In this case, x equals cat. X is the name of the variable and cat is the value of the data it contains. We can call our variables any kind of name. I could have named the variable y or b. So for instance, y equals cat, b equals cat. It's useful to name a variable so that it will make sense to you in your code. So if I was going to store different hair colours in my variable, I might name it hair colour and assign it a value of black. To write this in Python, we would use the following code. Hair colour equals black. So there are a few rules when it comes to naming variables. For instance, it can't start with a number, but the name can contain a number. For instance, we could name a variable the first 15 or words over 5. Some words in Python are reserved for special use and we can't use these terms. We can see a list of some of them here. These words are important to be familiar with, but don't worry if you can't remember them all. A good code editor will highlight these special terms in a different colour to remind you. So now we know about naming variables and assigning a value to a variable, let's look a bit deeper into the values or data we can store in our variables. There are many different types of data in Python, but to start with we will have a look at 4 basic types: strings, integers, floats and booleans. When we refer to these data types, writing Python code, we use the following terms. String is represented by str, integer is int, float is float, and boolean is bool. Variables in Python are pretty flexible, and we don't necessarily have to give them a data type when we declare them. A variable can accept any type of data, and Python will usually recognise the type of data that is going into the variable. Some programming languages are more strict and require you to declare a variable and what data type it is when you're coding it. A string is a collection of letters, numbers or symbols. String is always contained within quotation marks. In Python, these can be single or double quotation marks. Some coding languages are more strict and will only accept strings in double quotation marks. Let's declare a variable called x and assign the value of a string to it. X equals, open your quotation marks, the quick brown fox, close your quotation marks. We can use the print function to return the value of x to us by adding print x to the end of our code. If we want to tell the program that the x variable will always be a string, we add str to our code. So x equals str, a string, and you're passing the argument of the quick brown fox. So you're assigning that value to that string. This is known as casting. So next, let's have a look at integers. An integer is a number that doesn't contain a decimal point. For example, 34, 7, -3. These are all examples of integers. Let's have a look at assigning an integer to a variable. Let's use the code y equals int, the data type integer, and the value is 6, and add the print function so we can see the variable y contains the value of 6. Float is similar to int, but we use float when we are dealing with numbers that contain a decimal point. So for example, pi equals float 3.15. A variable is named pi and its data type is float and the value assigned to it is 3.15. Casting variables like this can be quite useful. Certain values can be converted into other types of data if we have cast the variable. So for instance, if we look at this code, we've cast each variable as an integer. So even though a float and a string are the values assigned to y and z, we can see Python automatically converts them to integers. This also works for floats. We can see x is converted from the integer 1 to the float number 1.0, and that z is converted from the string 3 to the float 3.0. And finally, we can see casting strings. Y has the value of an integer 2 converted to a string, and z has the float 3.0 converted to a string. Pay close attention to the quotation marks, and remember, anything in between quotation marks is a string. The final data type we will look at today is Boolean. The Boolean is a special data type and very important in coding. A Boolean data type can have one of two values, true or false. Many functions in coding will return Boolean values, meaning they are either true or false. This binary type of data can be used by a program to decide to do one thing or another. It's an important element of computational thinking and logic. Let's see the Python code to assign a Boolean value to the variable k. K equals bool, the data type, and we're setting that value to true. It could be false. And if we add the print function, we can see the value of k. So a really useful function in Python is the type function, especially when you're dealing with variables. It's very useful when debugging. It can often help us to realise that we might have a problem with the data types of our variables. Let's see this in Python. We declare a variable named x and we assign the value of 22 to x. So x equals 22. We can then use the type function in conjunction with the print function to give us the data type of x. And as we know, 22 is an int and that's what it should return. So let's recap what we've covered in this video. Naming variables. Remember, there are a few rules when it comes to naming variables. It can't start with a number and it can't be called one of the reserved names. Assigning variables to variables. We can assign a value to a variable using the equals operator. Data types. The four basic data types we covered today are strings, integers, floats, and booleans. Casting data types. We can convert different data types, or we can be strict in the data types that our variables will contain through using casting. We can use the type function to help us identify our variables, and this can be very useful when debugging. So, I hope you managed to follow this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope that it has helped you understand variables in Python a little bit better.